Well, welcome everyone to the ninth Berwick Literary Festival on what started out to be a very dreary Berwick day here, but it has turned into a lovely sunny afternoon. It is absolutely wonderful to welcome you all here, and Bea in particular, who I'll be chatting with in just a minute about her debut novel, Berlin. Now, my name is Jackie Kaines Lang, and I should also tell you that Bea has agreed to answer questions at the end of our conversation. So please, while Bea and I are chatting, if anything occurs to you, do just pop that into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I think you're probably all so familiar with Zoom these days that I don't need to tell you how to do that. I'd also ask you to keep yourself muted and without video during the course of our conversation. We've found over the course of the past few years that just works better. Now, on to the important matter of the day, Berlin. Here it is. It's published by Doubleday, and it's available from Greaves here in Berwick, and of course from all good bookshops. Now, Bea, welcome to Berwick Literary Festival here in historic Berwick-upon-Tweed.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Excited to be here.
It is our great pleasure and privilege for me to chat to you and welcome you here. Now, Berlin is, for those of you who haven't read it, and you should, the story of a 20-something woman, Daphne, starting over in Berlin, as the title suggests, but Daphne is hamstrung by her own sort of contradictory, and some might say self-destructive nature. And also, of course, the unpredictability of others that she meets. And now it is, as I've said, it is a great read, and the Guardian newspaper calls it an unsettling, compelling read. It's at turns wry and witty, and also at turns disturbingly dark. It's beautifully constructed and compellingly told, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about your writing process, Bea, and about the novel and the story itself. So I thought we'd start out. I'd ask you to tell us just a little bit about deciding to write Berlin. Why this novel, this story, this protagonist? It's your first published novel. You may well have been writing before, so why this one?
I thank you for the question. I actually was not writing very much before. And when I embarked on writing Berlin, it didn't set out like a project, like I'm going to write this novel. I didn't plan it. I didn't have a good idea of what would happen. I was just living in Berlin at the time. And this character sort of emerged to me from a combination of lots of people that I met, some of my own qualities. So a voice and character came to me first, and I would write short pieces of what turned out to be the novel. I'd write short bits of it, and I would send it on WhatsApp chats to my friends and my mum, and they would encourage me. So it was very fragmentary at the beginning. I'd just write little descriptions and get very excited about language. And I think I surrounded myself by people who only gave me positive feedback at the beginning, and that really encouraged me to keep going. But it wasn't until at least 4 months of me writing that I thought it could be a novel. I hadn't thought about that at the beginning, and I think that was why the experience of writing Berlin was so fun for me. I didn't have any expectations. I didn't put pressure on myself. It was just for fun to begin with.
That's really interesting. It sort of almost sounds as though it was a way of staying in touch with people in a slightly different way. And as you say, kind of exploring also your joys of language. I mean, I think you are a linguist, really, as well as many other things which we'll come on to later. But so that joy of language and playfulness with it. So Berlin has received some great press, as I've alluded to earlier. And it's been sort of likened to female millennial focused novels such as Megan Nolan's Acts of Desperation and Nisha Dolan's Exciting Times and My Year of Rest and Relaxation, Otessa Moshfegh. Now, I can see that Berlin obviously does resonate with all of those three novels on one level or another. But I guess one of the things that I wondered was from your perspective and from a female writer perspective, whether there's a bit of a frustration to be sort of almost collated into a millennial female angst genre.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It is a subject close to my heart. The way that even positive criticism is receiving a lot of women's fiction at the moment. Even when someone's being really complimentary, they'll say, this is just such an unhinged woman novel, or this is such a sort of hot millennial mess novel.
Yeah, hot mess and all of those sort of terms.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all the authors who you listed, I really admire and love their work, but I do not particularly like how they are spoken about. And I don't like how women's fiction, despite the fact that women's fiction is being, is very sort of successful and popular at the moment, it is put into this small restricted category of, women's millennial fiction. And what that does, I think, is that it really takes away from often from the integrity and the impact of the works that we're discussing. So what it implies when you see women's work under that restricted category is that somehow women only address women's issues, and that all of these stories, Tessa Moshfegh's work, Nolan's work, are just engaging with sort of, girl problem, 20-something girl problems. And somehow when we talk about work in that way, it really robs it of any existential profundity. We never talk about men's work in those terms, because when men write, we take it for granted that they're touching upon, the quick of the human
universal.
Experience. Yes, it's universal.
Yes, there's something reductive about it. But if we're talking about, thinking of the Beat Generation and Kerouac and all of that, no one would have called, they were interesting, but no one would have called them hot mess, for example.
Yes. They were seen to be really sort of counterculture, and they were seen to be telling us something about the human experience. Whereas the way we're framing and receiving a lot of women's fiction is we're saying they're telling us about young girls' experience, and they're all, because they're girls' issues, they're all somewhat the same, and they're all a little bit, reductive. That's how we see it. And so I do think that, I love most of the writers I admire are women, and I love women's fiction, but I think creating that separate category is very reductive, and it means that we don't take women's work as seriously as we ought to for its, more critical and existential potential.
And I guess the more that we talk about those sort of things, which obviously they are talked about, the important is we sort of need to get men talking about it too. And increasingly, thank goodness, there are men who are standing up and saying, yeah, I agree, which is excellent. So thinking after that, which I was very interested to hear your take on that, we'll go back to the novel briefly. Now, it is set in Berlin, and Daphne, our protagonist, has been rejected by a postgrad philosophy course, even though she graduated from Oxford. She's fleeing kind of insubstantial, but kind of those dangly loose ends that none of us really like to have created or have in London, and she's going to start afresh. And on the very first page, in fact, she says, "I've always found starting on a clean page more inviting than amending an imperfect first attempt." Of course, that's a very writerly image there, straight off. But it's a great setup for the story. And perhaps we only realise how great as we get towards the end. So can you tell us a bit about beginnings, about deciding where to start your story?
Yeah, it's such a good question, actually, because, often when you open the first page of the book, if the writer does a good job, you have a sense that this book could have started 500 pages before, because you feel they're a real character with an entire life. I made the decision to begin in that way, where we felt like we were already meeting quite a complex person, because I wanted us not to know what had happened before, except in the sort of euphemistic way she referred to it. It's a very different beginning from saying, I was born here, these were my parents. Beginning right in the middle of someone's life, they've already moved. It's sort of, you're carried along with a certain momentum and energy, and also a lot is hidden from you. So I've had quite a few people, ask me, for example, like, why is Daphne so messed up, or why is she the way that she is? What happened? What were her home circumstances? What are her family like? What was her life like in London? And I love that. I love that impulse, the very sort of charitable and modern and contemporary impulse to look for the cause of people's bad behavioral wrongs in a sort of childhood background or childhood experiences. I didn't really want to let Daphne off the hook in that way. I wanted us to have her fully formed and broken from the first page. And so she doesn't reveal very much about her background. And a lot of readers did feel that would be relevant, but she's an adult, she's responsible for her behavior. So that's where I began it there.
Yes, although, I mean, and we will come back to this later a little bit, but she does, it's one of the things about having a first-person narrator, of course. So we see the action through Daphne's eyes, and she does definitely drip feed information in. And by the end of the book, I feel like we know a lot more about her than we did at the beginning. So there is an element of that. But I think maybe it's a very interesting thing that readers, and particularly if they're well engaged, will always want more. So but what happened? Why? So that's a great achievement. That must be very satisfying for you. Well, as we said, we do join Daphne at this new beginning, although she's in her mid-20s. Now, Bea, personal question here. Your brief biographical notes in the novel and at the back of the Berlin and other things that I've read tell us that you were born in France. You studied philosophy in the States, and then you relocated to Berlin, as you've already told us. And there's quite a few crossovers here with Daphne, as you also alluded to. And I just wanted to ask you about dealing with those overlaps between your personal real life and the creative process, the idea of fact and fiction in creating a novel. And, because quite often people will assume that you are the protagonist.
Yes, a lot of people did assume that I was the protagonist. And I had people who were in the middle of reading it who would say, oh my God, don't do it. I mean, as if, saying, oh, I can't believe you've done that, really responding very viscerally, especially if they knew me, they would read it and become very concerned. The overlap of fiction and reality is something that, I find really fun and interesting. And I was quite determined to so, for example, the geography of Berlin is very accurate. So it's really based on real places. You can go to those places. And the reason I did that is that I love the overlap of, reality and fiction, and feeling like you're walking the same streets as a fictional character that you know. In terms of the overlaps with myself personally, I think what writing does for me is that it makes certain emotions impersonal. So there's certainly something very cathartic about writing about certain emotions that I've felt, because I sort of donate them to someone else and they don't belong to me in the same way anymore. I think a lot of the feelings that Daphne had and has, particularly related to her sort of great expectations about what adulthood would be like, in the sense that even if it would be hard in an epic way. Those are feelings that I relate to a lot, and those are feelings that I've spoken a lot about with people my age, but I filtered those feelings into a more exciting plot, and make more exciting things happen to Daphne than ever happened to me, but, luckily.
I love the idea of donating your kind of feelings, emotions to a character and then perhaps exploring them in more depth. You feel like you get to know yourself better through writing fiction. I mean, obviously there's a cathartic element, as you said, but self-knowledge, etc. as well, when you're writing this sort of complex character.
I think so, if you can be very honest. I think in some ways, if you're using yourself or even people around you as sources of inspiration, you have to see them very objectively, as who they are and not who you'd like them to be, and who you are and not who you'd like to be. And it's funny because, people react quite strongly to the character of Daphne, particularly because she's very self-absorbed and, self-centered. And when people react really strongly to it, I often want to say to them, like, have you spent any time with anyone in their early 20s? Like, she's not extraordinary, For me, it felt like all her sort of vanities and neurosis was something that I encounter so much. you know, which might seem sad to some people, but is also really funny. It's what's funny about being that age, is because, you know, you're trying to imbue everything with meaning, and every decision that you make feels like the most important thing that's ever happened in, you know, the history of mankind. So yeah.
Yeah, and that role of humor, I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, there is a lot of witty laugh out loud almost at times moments through that. I mean, that role of humor in the novel, I think, was that very important to you? Was that something you wanted to tap into from the beginning, or was it something that sort of developed as a process?
It was really important to me, because I don't think that things are ever black or white, you know. So Daphne's having a hard time, but she has some self-awareness that she can sometimes see that there's humor to be gained. And, you know, if I think about my friends and I, you know, who in our early 20s especially, you know, we're always like living in terrible places and working ludicrous jobs, and all that can be quite dark, you know, and it isn't necessarily a particularly fun time, but the way we got through it is by laughing. And I think in general, that's something that I've experienced in my female friendships in particular. It's a sort of hilarity at the dark that really is our power and gets us through difficult times. And so it was really important for me to convey that. And it made it fun. You know, I love, like, Daphne's quite sassy and irreverent, so I could say things through her that I never would say, but that I had a lot of fun, you know, writing.
I'm sort of jumping around here a little bit, but I'm tracking what you're saying. And I sort of feel, I mean, thinking about Daphne as a character, obviously we do become aware very early that she's an unreliable narrator, and obviously they're often the best and most intriguing. And we also, it's certainly not a plot spoiler to say that she has a difficult relationship with, or complex relationship with food and body image, and some really quite challenging issues. And I actually felt like there's almost the way that she deals with it and the way that she's written. There's almost a hint of Fleabag about Daphne for me. I don't know if you ever watched it or if our audience did. But obviously, Phoebe Waller-Bridge wrote that. And it's like there's something about that flawed self-knowledge and tricky little asides to the audience. And sometimes as readers, I feel like we do feel that Daphne almost takes us into her confidence, but we just don't trust it. And I think Phoebe Waller-Bridge, she talks a bit about finding the humanity in her characters so that you can balance those things and make it feel real, you know, a person covering pain and hurt with humor or bravado, for example. And I wondered if maybe that was a context that you viewed Daphne in at times.
Oh, completely. And I love Fleabag. I love Fleabag. I think it was, you know, I probably watched it. I was watching it around the time that I started writing. And I think, you know, Phoebe Waller-Bridge's, what she does, you know, her little asides to the camera. What Phoebe Waller-Bridge does is that, you know, she humanizes her character, but she also demands our loyalty to her by doing that. So we're on her side. We have no real choice about it, no matter what she does, because we have a privileged relationship with her. We're the audience knows her better than anyone else, than any of the other characters. And I wanted to recreate that sort of forced intimacy with Daphne, who, you know, she brings you along for the ride and you don't have much choice, but you feel a sort of privileged connection with her because very often she does tell the reader stuff that she doesn't tell anyone else. And when you create a character who is closer to the reader than to her, you know, fiction, her real friends and her boyfriend, it is this really fun thing that you can do because it forces that you, as a reader, you're pulled along by that. And I was really, Phoebe Waller-Bridge, you know, her work really inspired me. Yeah.
Well, there you go. It did resonate with me. And because the other thing I think about a sort of not particularly likable character, and I don't think you could say that Daphne is, she's not someone that you would swarm towards to make your best buddy, for example, but you do actually care. By the end of the novel, you really care what happens to her. And you just feel a bit, you know, you start feeling a bit broken for her as well, in amongst all of the strangeness and the obviously weariness of her own decisions. And thinking about actually drip feeding information from a first-person narrator. I just wondered structurally if that was really quite difficult, because you have to drip feed the right information at the right time and make sure that that's coming out to sort of trigger those sort of emotions in a reader. And I just wondered if that was a process of managing, or I mean, perhaps it just came seamlessly.
I think the impulse to drip feed did come quite instinctually, mainly because I wanted readers to feel like they were getting to know Daphne in the way that we really get to know people. So when we, and that's why, the question of reality and reality versus fiction is important to me. When we meet real people, we don't, have an immediate access to all the light and darkness within them. It's filtered over time. They come to trust us. We observe certain things and we slowly put the pieces together. That's what it's like in friendships. That's how you get to know people. And so I wanted that to feel very real. But I think in terms of the structure, I had the impulse to do it. Probably as I was editing, I had to sort of manage the levels, so I had to sort of at certain times tone it down, at other times tone it up, and make sure that those pieces of information were hitting at the right time. And that really, having second, third, fourth readers and my editor really made it easier for me to perceive when to do that. I need that. By then I needed readers and an audience to get it right.
Yes, I suppose particularly because, as you described at the beginning, you had started the process in a sort of fragmentary, piecemeal sort of way. So then to put it together, it's not quite like a film script writing a novel. You can't just jiggle around all the scenes and suddenly it just, you have to really think about what you've already given people. So in a sense, I wonder, what was the most challenging aspect about writing the novel?
The most challenging aspect was definitely the ending of the novel, because I started off, as I said, the character of Daphne came to me and the setting came to me because I was living in Berlin at the time. So I had voice, I had atmosphere, but I didn't have much plot. And when I was first writing, I kept doing this really funny thing of creating a huge amount of suspense around things that would never happen. So when I sent it to an agent, and I finally got an agent, that was something that she mentioned. She said, there's a lot of build up, but not, you don't really deliver on that. So I'm someone, I love reading detective thrillers and psychological thrillers. I'm really familiar with how to create suspense, but, I couldn't always deliver the goods on that suspense. So the hardest part was bringing, plot, voice, mood together in a way that would be satisfying for the reader. And I managed to do that only because I got really good support from my editor who really helped me through that finessing.
Yes, and tension is a central tenet of the way the novel is written. I mean, that does build, and but not in the same way as, for example, a detective plot. Although there are elements of that, and I can see that you've clearly taken from that genre to a degree. I think the other thing about Daphne is, and we've talked about humor, is that she is deliciously condescending at times. And that is it's so appealing in a character, isn't it? So clear things that you can grab hold of. So, I mean, she talks about fellow bus passengers as placid as cows. A man rolling her a cigarette in actually quite a nice way is, for her, one of the very few things they can do that I can't. And this act makes her feel like they might be of some use to me. I'm like, oh! And I think in a seminar, she's the one sort of, in a sense, constructive thing she does while she's in Berlin, in Berlin, is to learn German. So she goes regularly to German classes. But when she first goes to a seminar, she says the other students are mainly white men with septum piercings, dreadlocked hair, and baggy trousers. So, as I say, there's a kind of complex blend of laugh out loud and poignant, almost sort of painful humor in the novel. And obviously, you do deal with a lot, as we've said, of quite complex issues, as I say, sort of eating disorders, etc. And it would be easy. I mean, I have read things where something's got bogged down in that, but you don't. You do it with a very light touch. Some of that, I think, is having a first-person narrator who's got other fish to fry. But I just wondered how you, once you realised this was actually at the heart of quite a bit of the story, how you decided to approach that, and how you came up with this modus operandi.
Do you mean how I decided to approach the eating disorder?
Yes, the eating disorder and other complex sort of obsessive behaviours related to that, I guess.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, about the sort of condescension thing, really briefly, I think that was just very, very fun, to write. And it's a sort of paradox, because Daphne's really concerned with she wants men to look at her, and if they look at her, she's like, "Oh, you disgust me. How dare you look at me, like, how dare you objectify me?" And if they don't objectify her, she gets really upset. And I just think part that is sort of born of like the funny tension of wanting to like resist and conform to a patriarchy. Like, with there's a funny bind in that she's stuck
it's
in.
Incredibly human.
Yeah,
it's incredibly human.
To show how funny that sometimes is, and she sort of looks down on men and obsesses about them simultaneously. But to answer your question about, the obsessive behavior and the eating disorders, I was worried. I was worried because it features so much that, I remember saying, I'm really scared that people are going to read this as an eating disorder novel, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but I just wanted to show, people who suffer from compulsive or covert behaviors are very nuanced, as nuanced as anyone else. And I didn't want to reduce her to her behavior, which was why, in part, I only revealed it in a sort of glimpsing way. And I didn't make her really confront it. And it's hard to have a first person narrator exhibit a behavior and not constantly reflect upon the behavior. It's only in the later part of the novel that it seems Daphne recognizes that something's up with her. And, what I really wanted to illustrate with that is the extent to which she's in denial, and is blind like it's just not aware about her own behavior, which is, I think, the case with a lot of people who suffer from various addictions and addictive behaviors.
I think there is a line, isn't there, where you say very truthfully something along the lines that addicts are the last people to obviously be able to confront their addictions. I mean, that's the nature of addiction. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's an interesting one because, on the one hand, Daphne sort of presents herself as someone who, doesn't have many problems because she has such financial ease, in many ways, she's her life is very sweet in many, many ways, but she does have a disease that's incredibly deadly. I would describe her as anorexic, and I think it's the most deadly mental illness that there is. And so in a strange way, Daphne's always looking for various perils outside, and the greatest peril is within her. And so it took a lot of careful managing to try and get the balance of how much I took it seriously, right, while conveying how someone who's suffering from the illness might see it themselves. And I don't think I always got it right because, sometimes I read it now and I say, oh, is there sort of her judgment of herself, feels quite stigmatizing. I felt that it was honest, but probably not always an easy read.
As you say, it isn't necessarily the central part of the novel or the story at all, but it is, of course, a central part of the central character, which is why I think it's important just to talk about. And that actually is I think you've given us a very interesting and open answer about that. It's not easy. I think you've got a pretty good balance going on there. I'm just going to take a moment to pause and just to remind people that we are going to have a Q&A at the end of our conversation. So please, if you have any questions, do pop those down because that's why Bea's here. She's happy to answer any questions you may have. Now, we were just talking about Daphne as a character and how she reveals herself as a first-person narrator. But of course, she's also revealed in other characters' responses to her, and they abound. We have malevolent neighbours, kindly flatmates and fellow students, friends and lovers, and they sort of swirl in and out of Daphne's life. And I thought you might like to talk to us a bit about creating this cast of supporting characters, from, you know, gorgeous Gabriel to reliable Milosh and grubby Grousome to party girl Kat. You know, I felt as though you had quite a lot of fun with them, to be perfectly honest with you, and it was great reading them and hoping that Daphne would hook up with the right ones and not the wrong ones.
Yeah, it was really fun. They were fun characters, and I mean, a lot of them were intended as sort of foils to Daphne, so that we could get a sense of contrast. And also, you know, it's funny because I think Daphne is quite an unlikable, narrator, or a very irritating one, but quite a lot of nice people, a relatively high number of nice people cluster around her and seem to quite like her. I mean, there are some sinister ones as well, but there are a good number of ones who are sort of very interested in her and do want to befriend her. And she sort of, those friendships elude her because of her compulsive behaviors. But so that was another dimension that I wanted to add in, just so that, you know, Daphne's perspective on herself would be nuanced. And you'd think, well, Gabriel, you know, wants her to stay with him, so maybe she's nice. And, you know, the lovely boy who she meets on a dating app, Yoshka, he's very nice and he really likes her. So what does that tell us that we're not getting from her? I especially wanted and then I wanted, you know, the dark character of Grousome to come in and to sort of challenge like some of the interiority, because Daphne seems very self-destructive, and she is in a way. And it seems like all her problems are sort of manifested from her own psyche. But then I wanted an outside force who would be frightening and threatening. And I think that Grousome is very scary, and, you know, feels very real. Then it's up to the reader whether or not they trust how Daphne renders, you know, their relationship and his stalking of her. But I thought he counterbalanced, you know, all the sort of neurosis and self-created chaos.
Yes, and I think there are times when the way she talks about herself, you have had hints before, perhaps from a doctor or another friend, that actually the way she sees herself is definitely, I mean, certainly physically, but also emotionally, not the way others necessarily see her. And that's a really useful thing. And I take my hat off to you, because I think it's quite a hard thing to achieve with a first person narrator, that we get that nuance, that the way Daphne interprets herself and sees herself, and indeed the way she relates herself to us, is not actually the way others see her. I mean, it's very clever. So now, location, which is in itself a character, and you mentioned Berlin and your relationship with Berlin and the real streets and the actual places as important to you. And according to Daphne, it is a place where everyone seems to have just arrived, and it's full of people with no place to be and nothing much to do. So tell us a little bit about this construction of Berlin and why your novel, obviously you were there, but why it had to be set there, why that was, and how that came about.
Yeah, I mean, I think like all of Berlin takes place in idle time. There's no work in it, you know. And I was thinking,
you mean Berlin the novel, not Berlin the place?
Sorry,
you just had to clarify.
Yes, there's work in the city. Yeah, and you know, Daphne doesn't work, and many of her friends work freelance or you know, get government support while working under you know, being paid off the table. I don't know if that's the correct expression, but and I just thought, you know, any other place that wouldn't quite work. You couldn't live that kind of life in London, which is one of the other cities that I know well, or Paris, because London and Paris are expensive places. And they're also places where people are really defined in some ways by their job, because of the pressures of the economy. So, for example, in Berlin, in the real Berlin, you know, in the city, people would never ask me what my job was. And in a social setting, no one would ever ask each other that, because it was seen as like uncool to care about, how you made money. And so in some ways that means that the social fabric in Berlin is very different. You don't know quite what people are doing, and it's quite disorienting and very liberating. I mean, it's brilliant to go to a place, someone like Daphne, who thinks of herself as such a failure, she shows up somewhere where no one asks her anything. And it's true that, in Berlin, the real place, even now, when I go there, if I message, one of my friends and it's Wednesday in the middle of the day, they'll probably be able to hang out, because people have unusual and unorthodox economic setups there for various reasons. And that's why Berlin, the novel, was possible, because otherwise it would have had to happen in the narrow window before and after work. I mean, in London, it would have been impossible. Daphne wouldn't have been able to survive without working in London. It's too expensive.
But most of her friends, I mean, in fact, she's very lucky. She has wealthy parents who, as she says, she sort of slightly derides and despises in some ways, but they basically send her money. But she's also embarrassed by that. And so she does still lie about quite where her or what she's up to in some ways or other. And most of her friends do have work. And actually, it was something I kind of constantly wanted a cup of coffee while I was reading the book, partly because I felt like coffee shops were almost kind of a trope. I mean, was I going mad, or is that?
No, because I think that's the kind of work that I did around that time. So I was very in them, and there are sort of the coffee shops are a whole, very cool scene in Berlin. Her friends do have jobs, but they don't. But they're sort of they're quite relaxed, and they have leisure time and they have free time. I mean, they're able to work. In Berlin, I still know many people who are fully self-supported, and they work 4 days a week in coffee shops. They live in very cheap flats. They have time to do their art. I mean, that is still what Berlin's like. Of course, it's changing, especially with the recent situation, and there is economic pressure there increasingly, but there still is that sort of smidgen of freedom and place for kind of playing, which I've not experienced in any other city.
That's really interesting. And as a reader, I felt that we got to know Berlin with Daphne, actually, from the way that when you're first somewhere and you just feel totally other, there's a narrowness about your life and experience. And then slowly that sort of expands out in terms of experience of people and places. And that was definitely a very pleasing reader experience. I was thinking particularly, and I will not get the German pronunciation of this right, I'm afraid my German is very poor, the Tempelhofer Feld, which is the former airport. And that plays a central role in Daphne's Berlin, really. And I think, that vision when Daphne first sees it one evening, and it's kind of like teeming with all human recreational life. And I think she says it, I felt full of a kind of illicit hope, witnessing such human scale pleasures taking place on a site designated for machines and industry at war. And I don't know, that whole area sort of somehow I was fascinated. I wanted to go to Berlin and experience it. So it has a huge relevance to Daphne's story. And I wondered if you could just explain a little bit about it and that resonance that it has.
Yeah. I mean, that place in particular is amazing because it was built by Albert Speer, who was Hitler's architect. And it was, Hitler's airport, or at least intended to be. And now it's been repurposed. So there are still the runways where people skate and windsurf and stuff, but the rest of it is grass, and people go there and, have a great time and barbecue. It's quite an iconic place in Berlin. And what that place is a really typical example. It really illustrates what the rest of Berlin is like, which is it's an incredibly layered place. You feel all the layers. So, for example, it's very common that you can go to a gay bar in Kreuzberg, and outside of that gay bar, there'll be Stoppelsteine. So those small stones that are dedicated to, that you have on the pavement in Berlin, dedicated to victims of the Holocaust.
Holocaust.
And Yeah, and so you have, you'll have that outside a gay bar, and then you have, people partying on the Tempelhofer Feld. And there is this incredible sense of, wow, this city has gone in such a different direction, and we are right to feel joyful for it. Berlin is really a place where you can be yourself, express anything that you want, your sexuality, your gender. It's very, very accepting. And it's wonderful to feel that, especially when there is still all these remnants of National Socialism. And I think that's what's wonderful about Berlin. I mean, you don't go to many places and feel like this place has got better. And many people don't feel that, about all kinds of cities which become less affordable and, for all kinds of reasons, less green and all that stuff. And Berlin's becoming less affordable, but you definitely feel like for once we made the right step in history, and you can see it here and feel it every single day. And that's what's amazing about Berlin.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, I'm just thinking a little bit about you writing your novel in a library in Berlin and sending chunks of it to your mum and your best friend and having that nice, safe feedback. And you did say when I eventually got an agent, and I just wondered about sort of linking up that little process of how you moved from those friendly readers to actually working alongside, is it Charlotte, your agent, and Alice, your editor? How did that shift? When did you decide I'm gonna do this?
So I decided to send it out because my mum really liked it, and my mum is a sort of she's a reader who I trust. She's very discerning and harsh. So she wouldn't, it gave me great confidence that she liked my work. And so then I sent it out to agents, and I did the thing that everyone tells you not to do. Everyone says, you have to craft a letter very specific for this agent and their particular history and interest. And I was like, I'm not doing that. And I just sent out the letter to sort of dozens of agents all over the place. And every time I got a rejection, I would send it back out. So I sort of approached the process quite irreverently and aggressively because at that time I was quite naive. I didn't know about the process of looking for an agent. I didn't know it was hard. I wasn't in touch with any writers. I didn't have Twitter, so I didn't know about, social
you
media.
You do now.
I do now, but social media is the main way I found out about what that process is like for most people. And so I just, sent it off. And about 5 months later, I got one positive answer from an agent. So that's what it takes, Yeah. And then my agent, I think, wanted me to do work because of the huge suspense leading to nowhere problem. And so I did work on it, and then we sent it out, and then I also only got one positive response. So, I'm very lucky that it was published. There are many, many brilliant writers. And it's
unlike Daphne, I suspect that you had a very busy life in between as well. Now, one of the things I was thinking I get from our conversation and from reading a lot, the novel Berlin, that focusing on the female voice is actually maybe quite important for you. And I think one of the things I really enjoyed it, as I think I've expressed, but I found in your writing really engaging with some of your concise and evocative imagery. And I know that you're an admirer of Sylvia Plath. And I read a lovely sort of fan letter that you wrote, I think, for Female First, and which I really enjoyed. And I just wondered if you feel and see her influence in your own writing and other female writers that you look up to.
I love Sylvia Plath. I can't really say that she's influenced me. So she's in, as much as I can, I've sort of tried to be influenced by her, but she's unparalleled. What I think Sylvia Plath did is that she sort of brought suspense and horror into the kitchen, and she really shows us that, the domestic sphere, which was the sphere that at the time women were confined to, is one that's worth writing about and is one of profundity. And I think what Sylvia Plath gets so right in the Bell Jar, the Bell Jar, people sort of think it's a depressing novel, but it's actually a very, very, there's so much humor in the Bell Jar. So I think Sylvia Plath was sort of the original person who managed to kind of reconcile pain and humor in a way that I think is quite unique to the female voice. And I think is something, we see in all kinds of writers now, paying tribute to her.
Yeah, yes, definitely. And that we've talked a bit about that sort of pain and just real life, alongside, which I think operates again very, very strongly in Daphne's life. And actually, I mean, she's very high functioning, Daphne, because how she manages to deal with all the stuff that's going on and become sort of incredibly proficient in German is quite extraordinary. I mean, and that's another thing I think one has to emphasize, that, we still see this rather strange and compelling young woman still sort of actually achieving really highly.
Yeah, I think it was important for me for people to know that Daphne was like intellectually powerful, because I wanted to resist, the sort of patronizing voice that would say, just girls are sad sometimes, and girls really care about their bodies, like, and that's sort of the way that often issues that women happen to struggle with are really trivialized. And I wanted her to feel like an intellectual powerhouse, people would take her seriously, So I made her be very good at German, and she's very superior about that, So she looks down
superior.
Deliciously superior about that. And about, generally she calls people stupid who she thinks are stupid. And like, I think that was fun, because I'm doing a PhD and I'm in the academic world, and one of the sort of truisms of the academic world is that women are insecure about their intellect, or they speak up less in seminars, and women are not given tenure nearly as much for various reasons. And I wanted to create an opposite character who's incredibly intellectually confident and assertive, and just to create something a bit refreshing.
And which I think that Daphne is certainly refreshing, sometimes in quite startling ways. Now, you talked, obviously, research as far as Berlin, the place was, you were there and used a lot of it. But just very briefly, we have got a few questions that have come in, so I will address those in a minute. But just thinking about research, was that quite a lengthy process? I mean, once you realised the kind of book you were constructing, did you have to spend quite a bit of time researching, and what kind of avenues did you follow?
So I think that the way that I did research would be, I would be writing and I would get to a passage where I wouldn't know about something, for example, exploding head syndrome. That's something that Daphne believes she has early in the novel. And then I would just look it up. So I think it was a very sort of contemporary distracted way of doing research, where I would just Google things, Google, don't know this, Google that, don't know this, Google that. It was really important, and I take my time with that, and I take like a lot of pleasure in things seeming very real, and not taking the shortcut of being approximate, but it wasn't very systematic. It was constant, but not systematic. Well, it was constant, but not sort of designed and thorough in that way.
Okay, well, I'm going to say that's sort of, we're at the moment concluding our conversation aspect. I'm going to ask you a few questions that have come in. We have actually talked about this a little bit. This is from Liz, and they say, as a debut author, what was your experience of getting published by Doubleday? And did you get an agent first? How long did the overall process take? Were multiple rejections part of that? Well, in a sense, I think you have addressed that. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think that rejections are normal, and no one talks about them. When you look at someone's CV, it always sort of looks like golden, doesn't it? I mean, it's accepted. And I've been rejected by so many agents, so many editors, so many graduate schools. I've been rejected much more than I've been accepted. So understanding and being honest about that. I try to be honest about that, because it's sort of hidden and only the successes are shown. So that's part of the process, as much as, anything positive, the negative's part of it too.
Yeah, and I think that rejection, particularly in terms of artistic milieus, is something that does go with the territory and perhaps isn't expressed enough. So a lot of people, I mean, it is about whether you can, remain positive and upbeat in the face of rejections, because some of it can be quite arbitrary, I think.
Oh, completely. I mean, it can just be, then, I mean, they just get overwhelmed by something, whatever it is. I think it's not reading a lot of meaning into rejection. And being a little bit vindictive can be really positive. Like, just take that rejection and say, I'll prove that they'll rue the day they said no to me, which I don't think anyone's doing about me. But, that's a positive, helpful attitude to have, I think.
Now, another question here. Given that your book talks about challenges like eating disorders and other addictive behaviors, gosh, someone's done their research here, talking of research, Googling it. How do you feel about the fact that on Amazon's bestseller ranking, your highest rank is number 815 in self-help and psychology humor? Does that amuse you?
Oh my gosh, I didn't know that. That's terrible. No one.
That's hilarious, actually.
That's really funny. Thank you for sharing that statistic with me. That's incredibly concerning. I mean, I think, I've had some people who've said to me, it's allowed them to understand somebody else with an eating disorder slightly more. Because for people outside of eating disorders, I had an eating disorder when I was younger. And now it's really hard for me to understand what that was possibly like. And I think that Berlin can give you an insight into what it is, because it seems so irrational. They seem irrational, but our behavior isn't dictated by pure reason. There's all kinds of stuff motivating people. And I also think, in terms of addictive behaviors in general, they aren't very well understood. And I think it's useful to think of eating disorders as part of compulsive and addictive behaviors. So from that perspective, I'm glad about it, but I hope it wouldn't be triggering or, negative for someone who was going through an eating disorder to read it. But I've had generally positive responses from people. So maybe that is a good thing. Maybe it is a self-help book.
I think there was a statistic recently that said that trigger warnings are more triggering than the actual just watching something and seeing something, or reading something and seeing it. So whether that's true, and I'm being slightly dismissive of trigger warnings, which I don't mean to be, but, it is so, the psyche is so interesting, which is, again, a very core part of that exploration in the novel.
Yeah.
A delicate thing. Now, Claire, they say, and I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to read the question. It sounds like you have learnt a lot from the process of writing this book. Is the next one on the way or written? And if so, how has this book, Berlin, informed that writing?
Oh, so I am writing the next novel at the moment.
Alongside doing a PhD, I should say, which is pretty darned impressive.
Yeah, that has been slightly neglected. I hope my supervisor is not watching, but I've been focusing on writing more recently. I think in some ways, the response to how people responded to Daphne, particularly the sort of the moral judgments of her really interested me, and that is something that I'm interested in looking at in the next novel, which is also first-person woman narrator, mainly because I'm interested in very, very honest psychological portraits of how people think, and I think the next novel is similarly like that. It's about somebody who does something that we would all say is objectively bad. And my aim as a writer is to try and convince the reader that they would have done quite the same thing and that her behavior is very reasonable. So I'm really interested in sort of challenging the morality of readers, because I love that in certain novels. So.
And do you think your experiences with Daphne and Berlin have informed your writing process and the way you're doing it? Are you tackling this very differently?
I'm certainly, so unlike Berlin, where I had no plot, I began this with a plot. So it's plot driven as opposed to voice driven. But it was very hard when I first started writing not to go into Daphne's voice, because her voice is so, like, you could parody it so much. It's very easy for me to write Daphne because now I know her. So to begin with, I was writing I'm going to write not Daphne. So someone, and I ended up writing someone very bland. So I had to kind of do a Daphne exorcism of myself in order to get to the true voice of my next narrator, which hopefully now I've got to, but it was a challenge.
So there is a process of letting go after you've completed a novel is really the the crux of that, I would say. And it can be quite hard. And maybe you'll revisit Daphne one day.
Maybe. I've thought about it. Because I'm interested to know who she'd be in like 5 or 6 or 7 years. You know, who would she be now? You know, I don't know if she'll come back to me and let me know, but
there's a couple more questions coming, and I'll quite quickly try and address those before we are drawing to the end of this. It says, as Daphne spoke fluent German, she should have been able to get under the skin of various people. Hopefully you could portray others in a reasonable light. I'm not quite sure I quite understand the question. Do you?
Maybe they're implying they're not portrayed in a reasonable light. If that's the case, I think that's the problem with Daphne. She's in a sort of bell jar. So I think however much she tries to understand other people, she only sees the projected shadow of herself on their face. She can't really see them. That's what's sad. That's why she's so isolated.
And a very nice comment here. What a refreshing interview. Many authors are deadly dry and boring to listen to. Even if they're brilliant on the page. So it's great to listen to a new author who's also very entertaining and honest and connectable. Smiley face. Thank you. And thanks also to Jackie for keeping the chat so lively. Well, thank you. And here a little request from George, really, to round this up. Could you share some recent reading recommendations, please? Have you got any of those? I suspect you've been reading a lot for your PhD, have you?
I should be reading for my PhD more. So I think that Real Life by Brandon Taylor is an incredible novel. If people haven't read it, I think it came out in 2020. I'm not exactly sure. It was shortlisted for the Man Booker, but many people have not read it. So that's Real Life by Brandon Taylor. Red Comet by Heather Clark is the new biography of Sylvia Plath. And even if one isn't interested in Sylvia Plath, it's an amazing character study. And I found it very, very helpful for my own writing to use, Plath's journals, letters, poems, prose to try and fully understand a character. It's a real challenge. And I think so much of fiction is about trying to understand or realistically create character. Those are the two that I've read recently. I also read In the Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, which is not contemporary, but also often overlooked. That's an amazing novel about the desire we have for things to have a reason and how we kind of cope with chaos. And it's also a thriller set in a monastery. And it's difficult, but really well.
Well, for me, Bea has slightly frozen, which is a first. I don't know if she has for the rest of you, so I may be talking over the top of her. But hopefully you got that, Umberto Eco, Name of the Rose, as her final recommendation. And hopefully Bea can hear me and you can all hear me. What I would say is it has been a very refreshing, here's Bea back again, a very refreshing conversation from my perspective as well. So I hope you've enjoyed it, Bea. And I'm just going to put in a little request. When I next go to Berlin, I've only been once. Can you be my guide, please? And can you take me to all the 100%. Best coffee shops?
Yes. I'll take you on Daphne's tour.
Girls trip, yes, please. That would be great. So I just really, this is the end of our session this afternoon. I just want to say a huge thank you to Bea for that really fascinating insight, both into the world of Berlin, her novel, the world of Berlin, the place, and also her fascinating character. So thank you, Bea. Thank you too. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for having me and for, the participants, your thoughtful question. It's my favorite thing to connect to readers and get to speak to people. It's a real privilege. So thank you.
Well, hopefully you'll have plenty more opportunity, and we've been delighted at Berwick Literary Festival to welcome you. I also want to thank all of you, the audience, for joining us. Without you, I mean, obviously we could have a conversation, but it just wouldn't be the same. So thank you. Just pointing out that the Berwick Literary Festival is a voluntary run charity. And although this event is free, if you do fancy giving us a donation to help us with our work, we do a lot of things in schools in the local area, as well as running the festival. festival, we'd be really grateful. And you can donate via the link that I think Peter and the tech team have just put up, or indeed go to our website and donate from there. And when you are on the website, if you do go there, it's well worth checking out the rest of the festival. We've got some wonderful events and speakers over the weekend. Today is Zoom, but the other events are largely in person here in Berwick, and it's just such a wonderful place to wander around. So you really should do it. And so all that it remains for me to say is final thanks to Bea and to all of you, and to wish you a happy rest of your Friday and enjoy the weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you.